In the last recording, we mentioned how the Germans were ultimately unsuccessful with Operation Barbarossa, that invasion of the Soviet Union. They were forced to turn back towards Germany. This was the beginning of the end for Hitler. So now let's talk about how Nazi Germany as a whole was brought to defeat. When Operation Barbarossa was going on and Stalin was tied up fighting the German forces, the Americans were now a part of World War II officially because of the Pearl Harbor bombing in December of 1941. Our forces and the British forces were mostly fighting at war and at sea. Stalin desperately wanted us to open up a second front in Europe immediately because of the amounts of men that he was suffering in his own country. I mean, they were directly being assaulted. And he pleaded with Churchill and Roosevelt to open this second front. But both Churchill and Roosevelt felt like defeating Hitler was obviously important, but they weren't quite ready to launch a mainland offensive in Europe. They didn't feel their resources and their men were prepared for that. So instead, they decided to direct their attention to Northern Africa, which is where the Germans had to come in and bail out the Italians previous to this, which had delayed their plans for Operation Barbarossa, but it was still in Nazi control, in Axis power controls. So we developed a battle plan to regain Northern Africa and liberate it from Axis control, and this was known as Operation Torch, and it began in October of 1942. You can see it mentioned on page 152 of your book. There's a map that shows the different battles that were fought, and basically Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox that the Germans had sent down there initially, was finally defeated and forced to retreat. And you can see why Operation Torch was significant for the Allies. Even though it wasn't necessarily the most difficult part of World War II, it did have important consequences. You can see those on page 152, the bullet points in the middle of the page. And the fact that probably the biggest one was the fact that now we had a launching pad for our next big target, which was the country of Italy. Of the three Axis countries, that was probably the easiest one to defeat. We had our hands tied up in the Pacific with Japan with all of the island hopping campaigns that we were doing, and obviously the Germans were still in firm control of most of Europe, so we felt like Italy was the easiest one to take out. So having North Africa back under Allied control was an important staging ground. Also, you can see that Hitler was not able to get Egypt in the Suez Canal, which was important for movement of troops and access to the Middle East and the oil. And also it gave our troops experience with fighting large-scale invasions, which would be necessary for the D-Day invasion later on. So that's why Operation Torch was significant. Not so much that it was a difficult operation, but it gave us some logistical capabilities that we didn't have before. And eventually it led to the fall of Italy, which eliminated one of the three Axis countries. After Operation Torch was done, we then focused our attention on Italy itself, beginning in July of 1943. And you can see at the bottom of 152 that it ended up causing the downfall of Mussolini. If you look at the sidebar on that page in the yellow, you can see what Mussolini's eventual fate was. Not only was he dismissed by his own government and replaced, he eventually was captured and killed and had his body hung from a meat hook. So that you can see that he had some definite negative consequences in his life. And then after that, we were able to gain the island of Sicily right off the coast of Italy and then launch a full-scale invasion of the peninsula itself. But it was a difficult campaign because the Germans did not want to lose Italy. Obviously, that was their closest ally geographically, and they didn't want to lose that foothold in Europe. So the Germans refused to give in and let the Italians fall, and therefore the Allies had to fight a pretty vicious campaign. It was costly for the Germans because they had to divert troops away from Russia into Italy, similar to how the Germans had to bring forces down into North Africa to back up the Italians. So you can see that in both World Wars, the Germans were forced to bail out their allies and try to prop them up as long as possible, which took away from the goals of Germany itself. So despite the difficult campaign that we had to fight up the peninsula, we were still able to succeed. We captured Rome in June of 1944, which corresponded with the D-Day launching, which was also in June of 1944. But Italy itself didn't come under firm Allied control until April 1945, which is when we had had success with the Normandy invasion and the retake of Europe, basically. But the fact that we had taken Italy out of the war, you can see the consequences for that at the bottom of page 152. Obviously, it deprived Germany of an ally, but you can also see that our beginnings of the Cold War are going to start to come out here. That bottom bullet point on page 152. The fact that Stalin couldn't accuse the other Allied countries, even though we were all working together to bring down Hitler, there definitely was some tension between the Soviets and the American and British. We tended to side, obviously, with the British on different strategies and policies that we wanted to implement. Stalin often questioned those and accused us of being selfish and having ulterior motives, and this tension would directly lead to the Cold War at the end of World War II, which was that 40-year-long period of time of tension between the Americans and the Soviets. We did not want to give them a propaganda advantage by allowing them to accuse us of letting them have to do all the fighting against Hitler. So us taking Italy allowed us to shut him down that way, which would be important later on. After North Africa was taken by the Allies and then Italy, we were free to then open up a second front in Europe to take back the rest of mainland Europe from Nazi control. This became known as Operation Overlord, but it's often known as D-Day. The reason for that is because the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, Dwight Eisenhower, often had a habit of designating any big operation with the letter D. So that's why this was known, the first day of the Operation Overlord is referred to as D-Day, because that was the beginning of the massive amounts of Allied forces that entered France and began the takeover of Europe. June 6, 1944 was D-Day, and it occurred in the northern coast of France, also known as the Normandy coast. There was an enormous amount of preparations for this assault because we knew the amount of resistance that the Germans would put up. If you look at that first paragraph on page 153, you can see how much preparation was involved. It took over a year, almost 2 years, to prepare adequately for this offensive. It required stockpiling of supplies, anything from blood units that would be ready to transfuse to soldiers that were wounded, to food, to ammunition and weaponry, to uniforms, tanks, aircraft. Everything had to be assembled and ready. It was a joint operation between the ground forces and air forces, and they all had to be working together precisely for this to be accomplished the way that we wanted to. We also did a lot of subterfuge in trying to trick the Germans that we were going to be landing somewhere different than where we actually did come in. The Germans anticipated that we were going to open up a second front, especially after they saw that we had defeated the Italians and took back North Africa. But they didn't know exactly where that was going to be, so we spent a lot of time trying to trick them, which ended up being successful for us as well. You can see the results of D-Day at the bottom of 153, that within a month over 1 million men had come across the Normandy coast, worked their way through northern France and liberated it. Also liberated some important areas of Belgium, like the cities of Brussels and Antwerp. But the Germans again put up a lot of resistance, and they were able to be successful in different parts, just like we were successful. And if you've ever heard of the Battle of the Bulge, this is sometimes referred to as the last final offensive for the Germans. This is where they were able to put off the Allied forces and outflank them and temporarily regain some ground that we had taken with this Operation Overlord. But it wasn't enough to overcome the massive amounts of troops and supplies that had been launched into mainland Europe. So once again, Operation Overlord ended up becoming a war of attrition for the Germans. Just like in World War I with the trenches on the Western Front, Germany simply ran out of supplies, and that's exactly what happened here. This Battle of the Bulge, which lasted from December 1944 to January of 1945, saw the Germans running out of supplies that it had needed. They had suffered a lot with its loss in Operation Barbarossa. The Russians were closing in on the east, we were closing in on the west, and they just simply couldn't supply their troops. They no longer had the Italians, and the Japanese were fighting their own war in the Pacific, so Germany was pretty much on its own and being invaded on two fronts. So finally, in March of 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine River, a very significant location in Germany, and Hitler knew that it was over. He committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, which is sometimes debated, and no, he's not Tupac. He is dead, but the conditions of his suicide are left a little bit of a mystery, and so exactly where and when it happened is disputed. But he did kill himself, and Several days later, the German government that was left surrendered completely, and they were unconditionally in Allied hands at that point. Finally, let's look at why the Allies were able to defeat Nazi Germany, because as you remember from the beginning of World War II, the first 2 years were all about Axis control. The Germans had very easily taken over most of Europe in those first 2 years of fighting. They had gained more in months than the Germans in World War II had in 4 years. Hitler was definitely successful with his blitzkrieg tactics that he used at the beginning of the war. So it came as a surprise to many German people that they ended up losing World War II. So we have to look at two different things, just like we did with World War I. The weaknesses of the Axis countries and the strengths of the Allies, and which one was more of a determining factor for why the Allies eventually won the war in Europe. So let's take a look at, if you see the map on 154, all the different bombings and campaigns that were launched throughout the second part of World War II from 1942 on, because 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union is kind of considered the turning point in the war itself. So you can see all the different areas that the Allies strategically bombed with the orange color in Germany. The arrows representing the different movements of Allied troops and German troops to try to launch counteroffensives, and the different directions that the Soviets took at the same time, trying to expel the Germans from their country. Let's look at the weaknesses of the Axis countries first. The fact that Britain never was taken over by Hitler was a huge opening wound for the Germans for the rest of the war, because they were still considered an enemy. They were able to keep the war going by supplying the Soviets, and then once the Americans entered, that just increased and allowed for more planning for an eventual second front to be opened up. So the fact that Britain survived was huge. Even though they were geographically small, their input and help through the rest of the war was crucial for Allied success. Another big problem was the fact that the Soviet Union was invaded at all. This was a huge mistake as well on Hitler's part. They turned away from Britain and postponed a land invasion when they couldn't defeat the Air Force. And so then they had to turn their attention to the east, towards the Soviet Union, which was their ultimate goal. But they had to continue diverting resources to be able to do this. And the fact that the Soviets massed together and refused to allow the Germans to take over their country was pivotal in the war. If you look at the quote from Stephen Lee, he's a historian that we looked at in Chapter 6, blaming Nazi propaganda for the start of World War II. And you can see his opinion on the effect of Operation Barbarossa and the fact that Germany took on a huge country, not just land-wise, but industrial capacity and the morale of the people. And this is what allowed the British to be able to regroup with the Americans to finally launch this second offensive that ended up defeating Hitler. So invading the Soviet Union at all was a huge mistake. When the Germans declared war on the United States was also a huge mistake. They had to, because of the tripartite pact with Japan, because we declared war on Japan, so therefore Germany had to back up its ally, but that just brought Hitler another enemy, and we worked together diligently with the British and the Soviets to open up that second front. We talked about how Hitler decided to pretty much take over his army with Operation Barbarossa and call all the shots, even though he didn't have the detailed knowledge that some of his generals did. Was disastrous. He didn't prepare well for the winter, and he decided to produce certain equipment as opposed to others that ended up causing a huge problem for him. And you can see that mentioned at the top of 155 in the second paragraph, that he was concentrating on producing V rockets when they could have been developing jet aircraft that would have regained German air superiority. Because if you see that map on 154, the Allies were concentrating air bombings of key locations in Germany. The Germans could have counteracted that a little bit, but Hitler chose not to focus on that. Additionally, Germany suffered from severe material shortages that you can see mentioned on 155, things such as rubber, cotton, nickel, and oil, and the fact that they didn't utilize their civilian population effectively, which we did. So definitely the Axis countries had a lot of weakness. They had to keep bailing out the Italians. It was a constant drain. And then you can see the strengths of the Allies mentioned here, that we grew stronger, both our morale and our resources, especially once the USA entered the war, and that we were able to turn our economic strengths. Since we hadn't really been touched other than Pearl Harbor, we put our factories back to work and did large-scale production. We had a huge amount of civilians in our country supporting the war effort with working in the factories and sending food and other items. And we made some very strategic decisions, unlike the Germans, with strategic bombing and things like that, where we were able to concentrate on the defeat of Hitler and get him over and done with as quickly as possible. Most importantly, we had the will to win. The public supported it as a just effort.